This week, I'm revisiting the plates you may have seen me throw and trim a month or so ago, and they've now been biscuit fired, waxed, glazed, and reduction fired, and I'll be showing you the finished plates at the end of the video. For this project, and flatware in general, I tend to use really soft clay as it makes the centering and flattening process far easier. This is reclaim, material left over from trimming previous pots. I slake it down in water and then spread it out in a thick layer on a plaster slab. The plaster gradually draws moisture out of the clay whilst also air drying from the top, and eventually it can be peeled off and wedged, which is exactly what I'm doing here, although in this case it is actually just still far too soft to work with. So I'm going to roughly mix it 50-50 with some much harder stoneware. I then cut thin slices of each and layer them, starting of course with a firmer slice, otherwise the soft clay will just stick to the tabletop. The whole lot is then wedged up properly, and every now and then I scrape off remnants that do stick to the table and add them back to the mass, until it wedges nicely without much material cleaving away. At a certain point I split the lump in half into more manageable blocks, and I wedged these until they felt completely incorporated without any hard or soft sections. Now, I have a lot of side plates in my workshop, many of which are quite old or don't really match my particular style, such as these very simple Timecodes plates. They're really thin and fine, and I like them rather a lot, but their shapes are really classic, and they don't really fit within the aesthetic I've created, so I think I can do better. This one is closer in the right direction, made with more angular features, but it's been fired a couple of times with a range of oxides and glazes covering it. The one thing it is a good size for a side plate, as these are smaller ones I made during my apprenticeship in Mace Hill Pottery. These were raw glazed and soda fired, hence the really interesting surfaces they have, but they're also a touch on the small side and are finished really roughly in comparison to my work these days. It always feels a bit strange looking at bygone pots, but I'm glad I've kept all of these as an archive so that I can clearly see the direction and change the style of work I create has taken. All of these plates are a bit more refined, and they're coated with my characteristic feldspathic crackle glazes you may have come to recognise in my work. I like these thick slab plates. They aren't the most practical forms, as there's no flange around the edge to contain whatever's placed onto it, but they act as wonderful canvases for glaze, and work surprisingly well for dry food, although they're a pedestal, really, a somewhat decorative object, or something simply to look at. This is a newer, lighter version, which is far thinner and trimmed with an actual foot. As the foot itself isn't quite so wide, when this pot is placed down, from above they almost look like they're floating, and these feel extremely refined and elegant to me. But again, they lack an outer flange, so I think the batch of plates that I want to create will mostly have some kind of raised section around the outside, or an indentation, something to contain in some way whatever's placed onto these. This side plate, for me, is the perfect size. It's just about 20 centimeters across, so I think if I throw all of mine about 22 centimeters across, they should shrink down to more or less the perfect size, as the stoneware I'll be using shrinks about 12%. I'll be using about 2 pounds of clay for each of these, or about 900 grams of clay. This should be enough to throw a plate with a thick base and some sort of flange around the outside. But if you were making a more traditional side plate, with a raised flange like you saw on those Timecodes plates at the start, I'd probably aim to use about 1,100 grams, just so you've got a bit more material to use in the outer portion. When making plates, I think it's best to have a bit more material to work with, especially in the base, as if that part is left too thin, you can run into issues when it comes to wiring it off the back. As for the water I throw with, I fill up 2 containers. The first, smaller jug, is actually the stuff I throw with, and it's in this larger one, which I position to the left of my wheel, where I wash my hands if I need to stop throwing and change the camera angle. I also like the fact that it has a sharp edge, as it means I can scrape the slip off my hands against it. Now, I'll be throwing the plates on these MDF bats, which I had a local woodworker cut out years ago now. They'll be attached to the wheel on a thin skim of clay, and by throwing the plates on these, it means once they're finished, all I have to do is simply lift the bat away with the pot on top of it, rather than trying to lift the actual plate itself, which would be an impossible task with the shapes I'm making. This clay pad is blasted with a heat gun until it's more or less leather hard, and it also has a series of grooves trimmed into it. I then lightly sprinkle some water on the pad of clay and dampen the back of the bat. The disc is then tap-centered in place, and then I rock it back and forth in situ to really get it stuck. If you try and use too much water, the bat simply won't stick. The same goes for attaching the lump of clay to the MDF. You can see that I've lightly dampened a patch in the centre, which the lump of clay is then firmly thrown against. But if I had used too much water and then tried to attach the piece of clay down, it would simply hydroplane off the bat, as there's just way too much lubricant. The soft piece of clay can be centered in moments, and then it's gradually pushed into a low, flat disc. If you struggle with this process, you can use something like a piece of PVC pipe or a rolling pin or a bottle to help flatten it. But if your clay is soft enough, it's easy enough to do with just the side of my hand, applying pressure in the center and then dragging it out. If the clay you're using is hard, you're going to have a much more difficult time making plates. It's that simple. And the great thing is, even if you do come across some air pockets, they can just easily be pierced like so, and then more flattening of the disc can continue thereafter. Once the disc is roughly the right width, I can begin throwing one of 8 different shapes I plan on making. I want these pieces to have angular rims, or stepped rims, shapes that more closely resemble the rest of the work I make. To create the rim, I just pull up a small amount of clay from the side. This means that the initial disc is made slightly larger than need be, as this process of pulling up a flange does eliminate some of the width. Once I'm happy with the rough shape, I can then begin to scrape away slip and neaten the surfaces. And I'm beginning with a shape I'm actually a bit dubious of, as over the last 5 to 10 years it's become a staple in plates made for all sorts of things. I call it the Instagram plate, and it simply has a flat interior with a vertical flange. And they've always reminded me a bit of a dog bowl, but let's see. I think if it's made refined enough, and with a rim that isn't too tall, I might quite like it, especially when covered in a thick layer of crackle glaze. I'll be throwing all of these with a base that's thick enough so I can turn them to have some kind of footwell. But going forward, if any of these shapes really speak to me, depending on the quantities I make, they may be left entirely flat, especially if they have a more complex rim. And that's the first of about 8 plates I'm going to make, with the bat scraped clean of slip, as you may notice, as this helps to stop the spread of clay and dust around the workshop. There are other ways of attaching bats down. For instance, you might have a wheel with pins, with bats made that specially slot over these. Or you can try using a big round of chamois leather that's lightly dampened and placed underneath the bat. Or you can use a proper bat system, which is usually made from a larger piece of wood that slots around the wheel head, and then you can slot the smaller bats into that. In a way, the method I use is probably the most impractical, as it requires quite a bit of setup, and there's a bit of an act getting the MDF stuck down properly. But it's quite versatile, as the initial pad of clay can be thrown to any size, thus matching any sort of bat placed on top of it. There's something so refreshing working with really soft clay and making low, flat shapes, as I spend most of my time creating taller, cylindrical vessels or angular forms, pots that I purposefully use harder clay for, as the firmer the clay is, the more strength it has. Whereas again, with these sorts of shapes, there's no risk that a plate can collapse, which means I can get away using clay that's so soft that it would be practically useless for throwing any other sort of shape. As the clay is drawn out from the centre, I pay a lot of attention keeping the thickness even. I'm going to leave this plate as a simple, flat, thick disc. This way, once it's leather hard, I'll be able to trim it into a variety of shapes. I then sponge away much of the slip and also clean the bat, and then I spend some time compressing the surface of clay, with my aim being to make it slightly concave in shape. This way, when it comes to glazing this, I'll be able to let the glaze fill this concave surface, which, ultimately, will lead to a more interesting surface, with more depth and character. The next shape I'm going to make will be very similar to the first plate I made, but instead of a thin rim, I'm going to make it quite wide, so that there's a visually stronger border surrounding the interior surface. I always begin by pressing the clay down as I centre, whilst also digging in my little finger to really seal the piece of clay against the MDF. If instead, when you're centering, the first thing you do is try and pull the lump up into the coning shape, there's a high chance you'll simply just pry it off the wood. I then spend a moment or two just cleaning up the exterior portion of the plate, which in many ways is unnecessary work, as each plate is going to be trimmed rather a lot, so focusing on the small details at this point, for me, isn't always the best use of my time. If you're a potter that throws and doesn't do much finishing at the trimming stage, then by all means spend more time now correcting the shape than later. But knowing that I often spend quite a lot of time trimming, there are often times I do leave things quite rough, especially things such as the lids for my pots. It's almost embarrassing how messy they can look at the thrown stage, but since every single surface of them will be trimmed in order to fit the jar, all that really matters is that it's thrown to the right approximate shape. Earlier I spoke about dampening the wheel head in order to help the clay stick. In reality, you don't want a surface that's wet at all. Instead, it needs to be damp and tacky, and I do that by putting some slip on it and then rubbing it in with the palm of my hand. Wooden bats in general, when they're dry, don't really stick to clay very well, so this step of preparing the bat is vital. This plate is slightly different, as I'm throwing it with an angular shape that resembles the rim section of a couple of bowls I've been making lately. This indented part at the top I thought could make an interesting shape. This will certainly make it a bit unusual, and if ever produced in a larger batch, they will not stack well. But it will create a shape that's quite easy to hold, I think, as well as being quite visually striking. And I should mention at this point that I'm not trying to make the most functional plate. I'm trying to make forms that are interesting and different. And if that means that some of them are less functional, then I really couldn't care less. With a bit of a twist and a lift, the bats come off easily, but sometimes if they've been stuck down really securely, you might have to use something like a thick piece of wood or a screwdriver to lever them off. With this one, instead of a raised rim, I'll throw it to have an indentation around the outside, a groove, if you will, a gutter to catch any debris that falls into it. By washing my hands in this bucket, less clay ends up going down the sink and into the clay trap, which means less clay is wasted over time, as after a month or so, after this bucket is full of hand scrapings or trimmings from pots, it's all eventually recycled in the same manner I described at the beginning. It's also in here come the end of the day where I wash all my tools. In fact, it's where I wash everything after finishing on the wheel, which means the clay trap underneath my sink barely fills up with clay. In fact, it's only ever been emptied once in 5 years. I'm already looking forward to how the glaze will pool in the groove around this one, but more than anything, throwing like this is a fun exercise, as I'm not just repetitively making the same shape over and over again. Instead, I'm actively trying to make each plate different from the last, whilst maintaining a few characteristics that make pots fit within the Florian Gadsby world. For instance, there can't be any curves, and I favour sharp edges, angles and lines. As I center the lump of clay, I link my hands with my thumbs, bridging the two and adding stability to my movements. This linking of limbs is something I try and do throughout much of the throwing and even the trimming process, as even though I dig my elbows into my torso and brace my arms on the wheel tray, my hands have nothing but a soft lump of clay to support them. So whenever I can, I'll connect them, resting one on the other, instead of one hand working alone. As you can see, I didn't wedge this clay particularly well, and generally all I do to get rid of them is prick them a couple of times with a needle and then compress my hand back over the surface, and you'll often hear them pop as this happens. In this case, I'm gripping my right hand with my left hand almost as if it was a rib. It helps to keep it stable and level as I run it across the surface of clay. This will be another simple disc shape, which will be further refined at the leather hard stage. And for the last side plate, I'm going to throw a shape that's quite similar to many pieces I've made on my channel lately. It's going to have a stepped rim, so it's thrown thick initially, and then I'll use a kidney just to press down one half of that thickness to create a small step. That's the last of these experimental plates thrown, but you might have noticed there was a very particular step I missed, and that's separating them from the MDF bats. This is a process I prefer to do at the end of the day or even the following morning, as I find their shapes are distorted less. They've also purposefully been thrown on bats that are wider than the plates. This way, when it comes to wiring them off, there's plenty of space for my hands to actually drag the wire through on either side. If they're made on a really small bat, it's actually much more difficult to keep the wire completely taut and level as it's dragged underneath the plate. As I don't have a damp cupboard in the studio, I often make small temporary canopies like this to cover pots so they don't dry out too much as they're left unattended. It's better being safe than sorry and covering your work than coming in the following morning to a bunch of pots that are far too dry to trim. The fact that the plates are also still attached to the bats helps them dry flat, whereas if I had wired them off and then left them overnight, there's a chance if a draft hit them from one side, the plates would dry on that side and peel up, the shapes warping, which is the last thing you want for flatware. Throughout the entire process of making flatware, you want to keep it flat, as it's when things are bent too much, say when you're flipping a plate upside down to trim the bottom, that you create distortions that will only come back to haunt you later. That's why I don't just pick this piece up and flip it upside down so its base can dry. Instead, it's carefully moved onto a new bat where it'll be kept flat to hopefully prevent any warping from occurring. Although I think I should have wired these off the night before, as I think they're a touch too firm for wiring off like this. This technique, by the way, is a good one to learn. I brace the bat against my knee, which you can see on the left, and then drag the taut wire beneath the pot towards me. I do this as if you try and wire a plate off, or anything without bracing the bat tends to just be dragged across the tabletop, and it can actually be really difficult to get the wire to dig underneath the vessel. It's for that reason that I use this scraper to sometimes create a groove on one side of the pot, as it makes a channel, a guide, so that the wire can travel more evenly underneath. That's exactly what I'm doing here, creating a groove which helps the wire catch purchase so that it's dragged through correctly. All of the excess, by the way, is simply scraped off and thrown into the reclaim bucket, eventually becoming the very same material you saw me wedge up at the beginning of this video. I also tend to use it like a sponge to pick up all the small burrs of clay on the worktop before chucking it into the slot bucket. It's now the following morning, and I left the plates on the wooden workbench so that moisture could be drawn out of the bases of them overnight. And just to make sure they're flat, I ended up piling up a few between bats and pressing them together. When it comes to trimming these, I want them to be completely leather hard, or rather, I want their consistency to be exactly the same on top and bottom, especially the expanse in the centre, as if this part is too wet when it comes to trimming them, you'll find that the base of your plate simply sags inward, unless of course you place something underneath the plate as you trim it, which is something I do regardless, even though this plate is the perfect state of leather hard to trim. Prior to trimming, the pot should hold its shape. At this point, it shouldn't feel cold and damp and sticky, and if you can feel the vessel moving and distorting as you hold it, then it's still far too soft to trim. Now, in order to help me keep these flat as I trim them, I'll be turning them on bats. This way, when it comes to flip them upside down, I can simply sandwich them between two bits of MDF and then flip them over that way. Despite there not really being much trimming to do on the tops of some of these, I'm still going to be refining practically every surface of these plates. I begin by lightly trimming the interior form to make it perfectly flat, and then I scrape over these turning marks so that it's flatter and more even, which ultimately means the glaze itself will sit more smoothly on this surface. The rim was sitting a bit too proud for my liking, so I turned it back to be lower, and I'm also going to trim it to come to a beveled edge on the outside. This way the sharper lip should interact with the glaze more interestingly. In order to trim the exterior shape, I'm going to pin the plate down with a spinner, which I centre just to make holding it down easier, and as I trim you can see how I bridge my thumb onto the turning tool, adding stability to both my hands as one rests on the other. The last thing I do for the top surface is bevel the edge so it's nice and smooth, and then I place a few sheets of foam inside the form, another bat then goes on top, and then this entire assemblage can be flipped upside down. The foam itself will support the base so that I can trim it relatively thin without this expansive clay bowing inward at all, although it's helpful to remember that it is only foam, so if you press down really hard it will of course still distort. What's also helpful is using the right pottery tools. And whilst I use one of these steel trimmers just to smooth the surface, when it actually comes time to hollow out the footwell, I'll use a much sharper tungsten carbide tool, as when using those I don't need to apply nearly as much downward pressure to remove material, which means there's much less of a chance that I'll distort the underside by applying too much force on the base. At the same time, when you're using sharp tools, as the walls of clay don't move so much, it can at times actually be quite difficult to gauge the thickness of the part you're trimming. So if you are unsure, and you're worried you might trim away too much, simply stop the wheel, pick the object up carefully and feel the cross-section. There's nothing wrong with interrupting the trimming process if you're just gaining information that will help you later. And by doing this enough, you gain experience, and in your mind's eye you'll have a better idea of how much material you can remove when it comes to trimming. I get asked the question a lot, how do you know when to stop trimming? And the answer is just like anything else really. After you've thrown enough pots, you'll know when to stop pulling up the walls out of fear of making them too thin. And the exact same thing can be applied to trimming. Before this object was turned, I held it, I felt its weight, and I ran my fingers over it to get an idea of the cross-section. And that's all information I retain as I'm actually trimming the object. I'm not just turning blind. I've assessed the pot visually and physically and trim accordingly. This plate is very much like the dog bowl I just turned, but with this one I'm going to leave the rim intentionally thick and chunky, and I think I'll be coating this with the white feldspathic crackle glaze I use. This is often how I work. Even at this point I've got a good idea about which glaze to use on each piece. And then when it comes to actually glazing all the pots, I begin with the white and I set out all the pieces I want to coat with it. Then I move on to the pale green and then the dark green. And as the only thing that's changing in between each is the percentage of iron oxide, as it's this that creates the green colour of my glaze, I don't actually have to wash any of my tools, as I'm always moving from a glaze with less iron to one with more. And as all the raw materials in the base glaze remain the same, there's no way I can dilute or contaminate the glaze I'm moving on to. As these pots are so low and wide, they end up holding themselves in place really well without any bits of clay stuck around the edges. But you'll notice in this editing that occasionally they do appear out of nowhere, as sometimes all I need is a tiny bit of support around the outside. All it takes is for the tool to very lightly catch on, say, a large particle of grog, and that's enough to draw the entire plate off centre. But even with the small lumps of soft clay pressed around the rim, that's no guarantee that your plate will stay in place. Generally, if you try and cleave away a lot of material at once, that's when things typically go wrong. So instead, when I trim, I try to only remove a small amount at once, using the sharp tip of the blade to remove more material, rather than digging in the entire expanse of metal. It's a wildly simple shape, but it feels quite brutalist and severe, and I quite like that. Next is the shape with the angular exterior, and I think this is the piece I'm most excited to see finished, as it's the most unusual of the bunch. It feels like there's quite a lot of material in that outside section, or at least the vessel certainly felt heavy when I picked it up, so I think this piece will require quite a bit of trimming. Again, I've got two hands on the tool to keep it stable, although in this instance I don't think that's the best idea. It's tricky when turning, as it's helpful to have a hand on the pot itself. Just in case anything does go wrong, that hand is waiting, ready to catch it. But perhaps that's more relevant with cylindrical, taller vessels, whereas this wide, weighty plate really felt like it was held in place securely. If the metal scraper leaves a scratchy surface, I tend to go over this with a plastic kidney, as it burnishes and smooths over the worst of the scratch marks that are left by the small particles of grog contained in this body. This particular stoneware contains 10% grog. This is coarse powder, silica and pre-fired ceramic material that's ground up and sieved and added in various grades back to the clay body. For pots like plates, it can be really helpful as it prevents cracking, distorting and warping in a pot, which is fantastic as those are probably the three biggest issues that arise when making flatware. The only other issue I could imagine myself running into, especially with this batch of experimental plates, is cracks forming in places where I've had to leave certain parts thicker than others. But as long as I dry these out very slowly to bone dry, that should prevent any issues from happening. The last thing you want to do with plates, like this after they've been trimmed, is to leave them out in such a way that they dry faster on one one side than the other, as that will very likely cause them to distort. Instead, ideally you want to dry out the entire circle evenly. So what I tend to do is to leave them wrapped up in plastic for a couple of days to really harden up and dry out post trimming, because as I turn away the outer layer, I'm revealing clay inside that's softer. Then, after a couple of days, I unwrap them and place them somewhere where air can circulate all the way around them. As in, I don't place them on a shelf right next to a wall, as this means there'll be more airflow on one side than the other. So I usually just place them in the middle of my workbench, with a good amount of space between each. Then, as they're drying over a period of days, I spin them periodically, not in such a way that it grinds across the tabletop, but I gently pick them up and turn them about 90 degrees. And I gently press on the plates to see if they teeter from side to side. And if they do, and the plate is still sort of leather hard, I'll place it in between two MDF bats and give it a squeeze. But if worse comes to worse and the piece is teetering from side to side, or it spins, I simply wait until the piece is bisque-fired, and then I grind the bottom of the plate against a large diamond pad which spins on my wheelhead, removing the very small irregularity that no longer allows it to sit flat. It looks very similar to the rims of these, I think, and now I'm thinking what other designs I can add this motif to. It's going to be interesting to see how the glaze settles on the exterior shape, but for now, I'm a fan.
Oh, hi Chi.
The next plate to be trimmed is one of the thick slabs without any decoration, and I want to leave this one mostly that way, although I will trim this one to have a large undercut on the bottom, so it appears almost as if it's floating. I begin by centering the bat, and then I centre the thick disc of clay on top of it. In theory, it really doesn't matter if the bat below isn't centred, although it can be rather distracting if the bat underneath is spinning off-centre as compared to the stationary plate on top of it. See how it floats? It's quite interesting, but it can make glazing it tricky, as the glass will come into very close contact with the foot, and if the glaze moves even at all during the reduction firing, it can stick the plate down to a shelf, meaning it'll have to be torn off, which can easily damage the foot of the plate itself. For this next one, I'm trimming a flat flange around the outside with a section in the centre that's slightly hollowed out. The only issue with this one is I was left with very little material to work with on the back, resulting in a shape that could very well slump as it fires. And apologies for the rainy noise in this video. During the filming of this, it had been a really wet couple of weeks, but at least it makes for a cosy atmosphere, especially when trimming under the warm light. I'm looking forward to this next shape, as it's going to have a deep groove carved around the outside, creating a flange that's sort of the opposite of a conventional flange, as it dips in instead of flaring up and out. But it should still catch some crumbs, right? Or is it truly just decorative? I think so. I think I'm a bit unsure about the rim on this. Perhaps it should have been trimmed back, like the plate that floats, so that it has a much finer edge. But I suppose I'll try that the next time I make some plates. This was a long trimming session, and my 3 o'clock coffee couldn't come fast enough. I know many of you are waiting for the pour-over video I made recently, or the results thereof. They're currently in the workshop, and I can't quite decide how to glaze them, but as soon as I figure that out, I'll crack on with the process. And the final plate to trim is the version with the stepped flange. Given all the tests like this I've done recently, I know approximately how this is going to fire. This shape is probably the most challenging one to finish, due to the small intricate steps, but there isn't much to do on this top surface, other than straightening the planes and crisping up the edges, and making sure that none of the corners on the steps are so horrendously sharp, otherwise they'll chip quite easily. This isn't a plate I recommend you stack. It's another shape to add to the brutalist camp, but it's one that will also frame whatever you place onto the plate really nicely. And isn't that part of the function of a plate? Anyway, I know in high-end restaurants it is, so why can't I do the same for my Marmite and butter on toast? And here they all are, and from this point I'll keep these plates wrapped up for a couple of days before drying them out properly. Like I mentioned before, the key to this is doing it evenly and slowly. If you're not in a rush to dry them, just don't. You're better off taking it slowly and being cautious. Unless you're a pro, of course, who makes tons of plates, in which case just avoid all of my advice. I'm now going to skip forward a bit. The plates are now completely bone dry, after drying very slowly for about a week. So it's now finally time to pack them into the electric kiln for a biscuit firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. And so far, so good. I haven't had any cracks yet, and they all dried really evenly and have remained flat, which is great, as that doesn't always happen. This electric kiln is heated up gradually, overnight at the press of a button. Think of it like a giant toaster, but with a huge lid on top. The elements in the walls stay on for longer and longer as the firing progresses, the heat contained, and the raw clay is turned into ceramic, a material that's far stronger and from this point on can no longer be recycled in the same way it was previously. For instance, these no longer degrade when placed in water, although they do still absorb it. In fact, like I often say when discussing this step, they're sort of like sponges at this point. And that's vital for the glazing process, as glaze in a very simple manner is a whole range of different raw materials that are thoroughly mixed together and are suspended in water. When these pots are then dipped into that mixture, the water gets pulled into the clay body, leaving a layer of those raw materials on the outside. And it's this that then melts and forms the glaze. This piece has a bronze speck, which should turn into a nice red spot once fired. Despite becoming much harder and stronger objects, they are still relatively fragile, and if I was to try and snap one of these in half I probably could, and they'll of course still shatter if dropped. In fact, it doesn't take much to crack bisqueware, and if you have something like a bowl or a mug, if you were to squeeze it too firmly, you can accidentally create a hairline crack in the form, which you probably won't notice until the pot has been glaze fired. Now, those keen-eyed viewers of you will notice a small change here. Instead of using a smaller brush to wax, I'm now using a sponge on a stick. I'll be switching to this for all of the pots I make. Its straight, flat end is great for waxing my pots, which are generally trimmed and made up of flat planes. You can also use the side of it if you want to be delicate and do more precise work, but you can also use the longer side to wax larger portions like so. It can also hold much more wax than my previous brush did. This layer of wax does exactly what you think. It creates a resist on the bottom of the plate through which the glaze will not be able to penetrate, therefore not adhering properly to the bottom of the plate. Water can't pass through the wax, and therefore the layer of raw materials doesn't stick to the pot. But there is still always a certain amount that clings to this wax, especially since the glazes I use tend to go on really thickly. If the glazes I used were much thinner, this wouldn't be much of an issue, but it still saves me from scraping back tons of glaze off the bottom if I were to glaze the entire piece, including the base. I don't think the feet on any of these were deep enough to be glazed fully. That's why I'm covering the entirety of the bottom, as if any part of the pot is going to move during the reduction firing, it's the trimmed foot on the bottom, and if it is glazed and it moves even a millimetre or two, there's a chance the pot could stick itself to the kiln shelf, and in this case that's something I just don't want to risk. In some ways I quite like the contrast between the glassy top and the somewhat coarse stoneware that's left bare on the bottom. I like the feeling of grogged stonewares that are lightly sanded after firing, so the contrast in textures doesn't bother me in this case. The best thing perhaps about glazing plates is how easy they are to coat. I grip them with a pair of tongs, submerge the plate, and as I draw it out, I let the excess drain off for a second before catching much of the glaze on the top surface, so that it pools thickly. I then keep on moving it and shaking it so any excess drips fall off the bottom, and then I slide it onto the tabletop before moving it from there to a wearboard. This way, by gently rubbing the plate on the tabletop, it removes any glaze that's settled on the very bottom of the foot. The shaking of the plates may look arbitrary, but as I do this, I look for where the glaze is most concentrated and shake the plate in such a way that it spreads out the glaze in those sections. There's certainly a knack to glazing pots, and it really changes a lot depending on the recipe you're using. If a glaze is thinner and contains more clay, then it tends to settle in a more even layer across the form. Yet, the glazes I use only contain a very small amount of clay. This means they take a bit of time to settle, and unwanted streaks or drips of glaze can form easily. So as the form is pulled out of the glaze, I'm proactive and move the vessel in such a way to get rid of the worst of these. The longer you submerge a pot, the thicker the layer of glaze will be that adheres to it. Yet you can hold a pot underneath for too long, which results in the clay body and the glaze being oversaturated with water. This causes the glaze itself to begin flaking off the pot as it dries, so I'm careful not to dip them for too long. At the same time, if you don't dip them for long enough, you're left with watery, thin results that can end up looking quite brown and dull, in the case with this clay due to all the iron it contains. The other thing that can make a difference is how thick the walls of the pot are, as if I have a piece that's been trimmed extremely thinly. This means the body won't be able to absorb as much water as compared to a more thickly potted piece, and therefore it needs to be taken out of the glaze much sooner, as otherwise it'll become oversaturated, the glaze coating it never drying and eventually flaking off. All of this is to say that whilst glazing looks really simple, it's a skill that's really user specific. I don't think I know two potters who do it in the exact same way, as there's just so many variables. And it's really important to remember that what you see working for one potter and their specific glazes may very well not work for you, so you need to trial and test and figure out your own technique. With all the plates glazed, I can now move on to the next step, which, if that was the easy, straightforward part of glazing, this is the far slower, more arduous task, and that's cleaning up each of the glazed forms, fettling back the tongue marks, and generally just working the surface to be as flush and even as it can be. By the following day, most of the moisture these contained has evaporated, leaving a layer of glaze that's much softer and fragile, which is not only easy to sponge away, which is great as that's what I'm doing here, but it's also incredibly easy to accidentally chip and damage this glazed surface, which you can repair, but it adds time to the process, and is a real pain. I begin by fettling the top surface clean, and then I place some foam really carefully on the plate and flip it over. This way I can more easily clean up the bottoms of these, considering it looks like the wax did practically nothing at all. I use metal scrapers, my fingers, a knife, and a wet sponge to do this, and all the glaze that's removed during this process is collected in one of 3 basins of water. This way, eventually, I'll be able to recycle the glaze back into the larger buckets these were initially dipped into. The thing is, it's just so easy to make a mistake. A bit too much pressure will chip away too much glaze, and then this has to be patched up, the glaze allowed to dry, and then it has to be carved back flush to the rest of the surface. The key I found is just to take it slowly, which I know is an awfully boring bit of advice, but it's always when I start to rush the glazing process that I end up making mistakes. And generally speaking, the more care I take, the better the results tend to be, as the neater the surface at this point, the better it's going to look once reduction fired. I chipped the edge of this one, which meant I had to delicately carve back the protruding glaze until it was even with the rest of the coating. But this is, again, another one of the things that you can't necessarily do with every type of glaze. This specific recipe becomes quite fluid on the pots. It moves and flows where it's put. This means that areas that have been patched up or chipped tend to heal over really well, but there are other types of glaze that just aren't forgiving, and will show these minor corrections even in the glaze-fired piece, which ultimately means that if you do make a mistake at this stage, the best course of action is just to wash all the glaze off the pot and start again. Here's that angular piece. I let rather a lot of glaze accumulate on the sides of this, which I hope lead to some rather intense glaze effects. The other easy mistake to make is accidentally grinding away too much glaze to create a thin patch. This would cause a small brown or yellowish spot to appear on the pot, and it completely destroys the uniformity of the glaze covering the rest of the piece. If I ever feel like there is a particularly thin spot, I can just dab more glaze into it and then carve it back smooth, but 90% of the time you don't really notice you've made a thin spot. And they're probably one of the most common issues I encounter that take a pot from being a first to a second. At long last, with all those glazed plates now tidied up, I can load them inside the kiln. During this firing, the plates cannot touch, otherwise the glazes that cover them will melt and fuse the two pieces together, yet they can be placed very closely. I generally leave about 2mm between each, but again, this does not work for every type of glaze. Some glazes expand before they contract, which can obviously lead to lots of unwanted sticking. I also have to be careful about how I handle these, as if I handle a pink plate and then pick up a white one, I could easily transfer some powdery fingerprints from one to the other, leading to a white pot with some mottled green marks on one side. With the kiln now fully packed with the 8 plates, 2 were packed off camera, the rest of the kiln can be properly filled. As the tighter the kiln pack is in a gas firing, the easier the reduction will be to initiate, as there's simply less space for air to occupy in the chamber. And with each of the 4 burners lit, the 8-hour reduction firing can begin. One of the main rules about reduction firing is you always light the kiln before you close it. Otherwise you could potentially fill the chamber with gas and then suddenly ignite it, which leads to exactly what you might imagine happening. An explosion. Every 30 minutes when I'm firing, I check the time, the temperature, the gas pressure, the air pressure, and the damper position, all of which is jotted down in my firing notes. This way it's relatively easy to replicate firings over and over again, together with spotting mistakes and seeing where things might have changed. Inside each kiln load of work are 2 sets of pyrometric cones. These measure heat work, which is heat over time, and it's by watching these and observing how they fall that I know when to end the firing. They're more accurate than the digital pyrometer, which only really tells you whether the temperature is going up or down. And being able to observe these cones is sort of like sticking a needle in a cake as it's baking. If it comes away clean, you know the batter is cooked, and that's sort of precisely what's happening here. This is the damper control, and when I want to initiate reduction, I move this to about halfway closed, which is something I do precisely at 860 degrees Celsius. I also increase the gas pressure and the air pressure, and this puts the kiln into a state called reduction. Simply put, what this means is that there's not enough oxygen inside the chamber for the fuel, gas, to burn properly, and as a result the fuel inside begins to strip away oxygen from the clay and glazes themselves, altering the chemical composition of the iron, which changes the colour drastically, as well as causing the pots to be speckled in droplets of iron, which bubbles to the surface as the oxygen is pulled out. Unlike my electric kiln, which is fired completely automatically, this kiln is fired entirely by hand, but it's not too complicated. You just have to keep the temperature rising at a constant rate, and after reduction, you just have to make sure the kiln doesn't stall, meaning that it no longer begins to climb in temperature. With cone 10 fully bent over, I can switch the gas off and the air, and then I slide the damper open fully and remove the bungs in the spy holes, with my aim being to crash cool the kiln back down to 1000 degrees Celsius, whereupon the kiln is closed up properly. This is called crash cooling, and it helps the pots retain their colour and sheen. It's now 2 days later, and the kiln is ready to unpack. The pots are always still quite hot to the touch, especially those on the upper tiers, so I tend to crack the door open and then let it vent for a while, otherwise I would just scald my fingertips. And here's the first plate to emerge, one of 2 stepped pieces coated in a pale green feldspathic glaze. You can see those droplets of metal I was speaking about, but any that are red are caused by bits of bronze, which there shouldn't be many of, but were present in the reclaimed clay I started off with. And quite miraculously, they all made it. Not a single crack or anything, apart from one of them spinning slightly on the tabletop due to a high point in the very centre of the plate, but there's a chance I should be able to sand this back. Speaking of which, that's the next step, polishing the bottom of each to remove any coarse specks of grog that remain present, as the last thing I want is for somebody to buy a plate, only for it to scratch their dining table. I don't want to grind away too much, as it's really easy to remove this flashed colour they have. And it's interesting, on this piece you can see the places where pots have been fired on the shelf before. Mugs, most likely, that have now transferred transferred into the bottom of this piece. Bizarre. So, without further ado, here's a run through of each of them. We're starting off with the dark green crackle glaze plate, which I think is my favourite of the two stepped shapes, as the dark green breaks dramatically on those fine edges, as it contains more iron and moves more. Next is the plate with the extra wide flange, which is just really simple, with a bronze spot in the centre, the glaze piling on this section, rounding it slightly. Next we've got the dog bowl, which I actually quite like. I knew I would. It's dead simple, but I quite like the height in the wall on the exterior shape. And the glaze is just full of depth, too. Next we've got the pale green stepped plate, which I think I might fire a second time, as there are two tiny patches of thin glaze in the centre of it. Next we've got the piece with the gutter. I like this one, but I want to try another version with a thinner lip, but the glaze did exactly what I want, pooling into the crevices and breaking on the sharper edges. I think I'm definitely going to make more of these. Next is the dead simple white plate, with a concave top, a taller foot, and a glaze that's come within a fraction of a millimetre to sticking to the kiln shelf. The next plate was trimmed with a flat, wide flange, indented like the one before, but this one doesn't really do much for me. I like how thin and refined it is, and I actually love the back. There's something about echoes of pots previously made embedded into this that's quite romantic. And lastly, there's the plate with the angular exterior, which just feels so unusual compared to the others, and unconventional too compared to most other types of plates. It's also surprisingly comfortable to hold. If you're somebody that likes to roam around their house or garden as you have your toast, I can't recommend this shape enough, as your fingers really do just nestle into this gap. I hope you've enjoyed this long search for some new shapes. There's a few here I'm definitely going to make in larger batches, and it's always an interesting exercise to put yourself through, to create a selection of work that responds to other types of pots you make, in an attempt to make everything a bit more cohesive. I know it was a long one this week, so thank you so much if you made it to the end. I've recently completed a firing with lots of experiments in, so there's going to be a few more videos posted over the coming weeks that show the entire process from beginning to end, which I know you folks love. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.